earlier in the afternoon. And now we are proceeding to a panel on India-EU relations amid the crisis and the war in Ukraine. So the day is organized. I'm Sebastian Farsis, we're the secretary of the FCC. Thank you very much for coming to the club. We're organizing that with the Indo-German Media Network. Natalie is a representative, so I'll hand over the mic to you.
Welcome to if you have a look. Okay. So, can you hear me now better? Wonderful. So, yeah. I welcome you here in the name of the Indo-German Media Network. We are alumni of the exchange program and we want to keep the dialogue alive. That's why we have now the speakers invited. And I think a very good interlude is the visit of the German foreign minister. And we all see by the reactions by the German government, also by the Indian government, that something has changed since the invasion of the Ukraine. And to have a bit more thought about that, I think I should hand over.
Everyone. My name is Sunaina Kumar, and I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, also I'm here really as a member of the Indo-German Media Network. I also was part of the exchange program in 2016, and it really is a labor of love that we continue to carry on. But we've all grown and gained from it a lot, and that's why we are a part of it. Natalie is now the chair for the board of IGMN. We have others. There's Sukhita in the room, who's also part of the network, and many others in Germany who've helped us remotely to put this together. So a big shout out to the board and to everyone who's supporting the network and to all of you for being here. And thank you for your support. And of course, we have, as you can see, some a very, very interesting panel, very interesting speakers. So I'm going to dive right in. We are here to discuss India-EU relations in times of global conflict. We live in very uncertain and also very exciting times. The world order is changing. We are moving towards a multipolar world. We have just emerged from the pandemic, and this year, of course, has been overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. Not to mention the climate crisis, a looming economic crisis, and also the realization that the systems that we depend on for food, for trade, for energy, all of those are interconnected. And so we all need each other more than ever. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. I will have the privilege to ask our guests the first round of questions, and after that, we are going to open it up to the audience, and we really want you to participate in this. Let me begin by introducing our panelists for today. Professor Umu Salma Bawa is professor at the Center for European Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is one of the leading voices in contemporary German, EU, and Indian foreign and security policy. In 2012, she was conferred with Germany's highest civilian honor, the Order of Merit, by the President of Germany. Professor Harsh Pant is Vice President, Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. He's also a professor of international relations at King's College London. Professor Pant's current work is focused on Asian security issues. He's the author of several books and writes for various Indian and international media outlets. He's also my colleague. Peter Hornung is correspondent and bureau chief South Asia ARD German Radio, which is the German public broadcaster. He is specialized in investigative research and has traveled widely in South Asia from countries like Afghanistan to Sri Lanka. He was previously a correspondent in the Czech Republic. Thank you so much for being here. So I'm just going to pose like an opening question to each of you, which I'd want you all to take on before we move on. And that is really addressing the theme for this evening. Is this a new era for India-EU relations? For very long, this relationship has been cordial but distant, if I can define it like that. And you can, of course, disagree with me, where both could not see why they are important to each other. Has that changed? And if that is the case, then how? Can we begin with you, Professor Salwa?
Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. So, for somebody who's been doing yeah. Good evening. Thank you so much. I've been doing India-EU for more than 35 years now. So, I mean, I could tell a lot of stories. And one way of looking at it is asking, like, there are defining moments and there are moments which bring a point of transition in equations. I would think that the war in Ukraine has probably provided a different kind of a framing moment. It's not just for, I think, Europe, but I think globally so. And I think that comes in the backdrop of the pandemic. So you would also be surprised that despite the pandemic for 2 years, the India-EU did see an incredible push take place at the bilateral level, because despite the pandemic, we had summits take place in an online mode, and they were really setting the agenda to move forward. So one of the defining things which came out of that was a recognizing connectivity on both sides. That was accepted last year. But also increasingly, I think what took place was to get back to the trade agreement. So I think that tells you, there's a kind of a different sense of urgency on both sides to get this trade agreement transacted. But as you do that, the reality is that the geopolitics has shifted dramatically. And so it's a learning curve, a very steep learning curve for everybody, because priorities are being put back on the table in a very different fashion.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I very much agree. And I give an example how this has shifted recently. I've been to a conference only 3 weeks ago in Singapore, which is called APK, Asia Pacific Conference, which in fact is a German economic conference. But people were talking there not about the Asia Pacific, but about the Indo-Pacific. And sometimes in the past years, maybe you could have had the impression that there's not much between Afghanistan and Thailand when from a German perspective. Yeah, of course, not the last 2 years. There a lot happened, but before South Asia as a region is not that known to Germany, because South Asia, most people in Germany confuse it with Southeast Asia. So South Asia is even colleagues do this. So I think something has happened in the past years already. Then came the Ukraine war, but it's COVID, the question of the supply chains from China. The political development in China, and these are all factors that contribute to a shift in perception of India. in particular. And so I think, a lot has changed in the past months. And but there's a lot of, let's say, wishful thinking about this. We're talking about a free trade agreement, but let's see when it comes. Yeah, have been talking about a free trade agreement for years, and so the question remains: where's the beef? And we have to wait for this beef, and whether this is really sustainable. This development we now see for a few months.
Sorry. Well, I think certainly, Sunaina, the question that whether something has changed, something has changed. If German frigates are moving into sailing into Pacific Ocean, if German bombers are flying into the Indo-Pacific skies, something has changed. And I think Europe has changed, India has changed, and the geopolitical environment has changed. And it's very natural that India and EU will start looking at each other through a different lens. And I think that's what we are witnessing today in this climate of very new geopolitics. And I Europeans used to ask, where is India's leadership? What will India do with its leadership? What is India trying to do in world politics? I think India is answering that question. So naturally, that confluence is very significant, and I think we are looking at the consequences of that confluence today, and hopefully this will lead to certain results that are equally consequential, because I think some of the trend lines are going to be long lasting. These are permanent trend lines, geopolitical or geoeconomic. And I think the questions, therefore, that we need to ask of each other is whether we can make the most of these opportunities today, because these opportunities will not come, say, 5 years down the line. And that's the real issue here in terms of that, in terms of Brussels and Delhi, and in terms of individual world capitals, individual capitals in Europe and Delhi. That there is a lot of momentum today for various reasons, but that momentum has to be used for some of the opportunities that we want to create. And I think we are at that cusp where certainly it looks like things are changing. So certainly things are changing.
Okay, I'd actually saved this question to ask you later, but Peter did bring up China, and I feel we may as well address it just now, and it's also of interest to you. The China factor, and how do you see it affecting the partnership between India and EU?
See, it always used to be this case then that when at one point when Europe used to say, look, we are an empire of norms. We don't do geopolitics. I think many in India would at those junctures would have found it very difficult to understand what European Union possibly then can do in a geography that is inherently geopolitical, and where China's rise was appending norms, was appending some of the fundamental arrangements that were put in place. So I think Americans were the first to come there, right? In George W. Bush's administration, America started looking at India through a geopolitical lens, and the argument became that India cannot be seen through the prism of Pakistan. You have to break that binary that India is simply a South Asian country. That the only time you discuss India is when you discuss Pakistan, when you discuss Kashmir, when you discuss some of the issues about Indian democracy. And I think Americans got there first because American priorities were global at that nature. They looked at the changing landscape in Asia Pacific then, and they said that, look, this binary cannot, we have to break this binary. We have to start looking at India through the prism of entire Asia and how China is rising and what that means for America's role and America's partnerships, including with India. So can we look at India differently? And I think that changed the game insofar as Indo-US relations are concerned, and therefore Indo-US relations after the civilian nuclear deal took on a very different momentum. Europe was late to the party. Europe came late to this, because for a very long time, for obvious reasons, Europe was not interested shaking up things with China. Things were going well. China was. Europe looks at the world through a different lens, as Indo-Pacific becomes the center of gravity of global politics. It's not Asia-Pacific, it is Indo-Pacific. So without looking at India, you really cannot look at what is happening in this geography. And therefore, India becomes a very important partner, both in terms of managing China's rise, so without India, you really cannot map them out. Similarly, on the Indian front, once the European Union accepted the logic of contemporary geopolitics, I don't think there are fundamental divergences there today, because fundamentally that argument has been accepted in Brussels. You have Indo-Pacific policies, you have a new China policy that Brussels came out with, and individual countries in Europe also have now charted. And therefore, I said, if Germany is doing this today, in terms of its military, this is a real shake. French and Brits were always there. Have to then consider that something really fundamental has altered in the way Europeans are now considering. I mean, there are enough questions there as well about the Chancellor's recent visit to China, and whether how will Germany manage its dependence, etc., etc. But I think by and large the trend lines are that the China question has brought the two together. And I think together they are trying to answer a lot of those questions, which are not simply geopolitical, but also about supply chains, but also about institutions. How do you create institutions in the Indo-Pacific? What do you do where you have so much disruption happening? How do you manage that disruption? And if European Union wants to play a role in the Indo-Pacific, how do you then bring out your other partners and like-minded countries together in informal alliances, the plurilaterals, minilaterals, etc.? So I think we are looking at that convergence. China has really helped the China question, and that getting accepted in Europe has certainly helped. And just very briefly, one point, there is often this issue of I'm sure you will come to this, but I want to touch this upon with the China question. There always this sense that in Europe that India is, what will India do on Ukraine? Why is India shaky, and why is India not response similar to ours? But I think for a very long time, this was exactly the question that many in India were asking with respect to China with the European friends. Why is it that you don't see what we see? Why is it that you don't see that China is really the problem? And I think it took us a long time to get there, but we have gotten there, and I think that friendship will evolve in a direction that perhaps will be positive.
That actually gives me the perfect segue to ask you, Professor Salma. You did bring up Ukraine, and of course, Professor Pant just mentioned about the whole question of mutual understanding. And of course, we know there has been a divergence of views on that from the start of the Ukraine war. EU has called out India on the issue of Russian oil imports, and India has pushed back against European leadership. What is your take on this from both sides, actually, and how contentious is this topic?
So it depends on how you want to frame it. I think if you think that geopolitics began only on 2014, or 24th of February this year, then one is sadly mistaken. I think you always have lived in a world of geopolitics. What you're seeing is the acuteness of the manifestation of what geography and politics does, and how policy choices bring states to certain points, so to turning points, which I think then leave you with different sets of options. So I think there has been, from the time the war started in Ukraine, a more American, a Washington-led idea to create a binary interpretation of democracies versus autocracies, which is a very narrow road to go down, because then you would have to put American foreign policy also under the microscope. And you would have to just go back a few years in time to look at why in 2003, when you had a preemptive war in Iraq, why that was also met with a lot of resistance within Europe. I think people have forgotten the story. And it's important to recognize and recall that. So that's the first point. The second is, when van der Leyen became the commission president, she had spoken about a geopolitical commission. I don't think she would have realized how soon wishful thinking would happen and what would come through. But I think the shock and awe you see in Europe is a product of geography and the fact that war has returned to Europe after 1945. I think that's point number one. 1992, the breakup of Yugoslavia did produce a lot of refugee flows, but it's an intrastate war. It's a civil war. It did not disturb the equilibrium of Europe, even though it was considered the moment of Europe where the EU should respond. But I mean, 1992, it's a very nascent European Union on the heels of the Maastricht Treaty. So, I mean, the first political steps as an actor, you don't see Europe responding. I mean, so the shock and awe does not resonate in our part of the world, and many people don't seem to recognize that in Europe, because India, for India, war is not just a word in the dictionary which happens once in a while. We have open borders on both sides. We know what it is to encounter low intensity conflict on the western sector, and on the eastern sector more recently with Galwan and the other developments. One has seen that. I think this is about the difference in location of a very important instrument of foreign policy. So war has not really gone away. I think that's an extremely important point to recognize. Europe's policy choices has put war outside of the territory of Europe. For India and for Europe, war still continues to remain, and that's the reason everybody's investing into it. The fact that, even within NATO, there was a call for increasing 2% of GDP, which then Germany was criticized, and all of it happening. So the mismatch in perception is also about not recognizing the geopolitical understanding of each other. I think that is extremely important. Europe is not able to recognize the vulnerability of India to China, right? They're so hugely invested into China. The recent visit of the German Chancellor Scholz for the G20 summit in Indonesia was via China. I think that just brought home very squarely and clearly the kind of geopolitical language Germany is speaking. And for India, the fact that China is a country with whom we share a border, there's no turning away from that. So I think there is this lack of, understanding the asymmetrical exposure and kind of a simplistic idea that just because there is a war, now in Europe, everybody should stand up. I don't think, and I've said this very often, I'll say it again this evening, the war did not begin on 24th of February. It began earlier in 2014. When the annexation of Crimea took place, that was more than enough violation of international law. You cannot salami slice sovereignty and then expect that when it is convenient, you will bring forward a part of territorial parcelization and then expect that everybody will fall in line. I think that has been the big inability of Europe and the US to recognize that states will stand up for their national interest. And in all of these years, in 2005, as Nord Stream 2 was signed, it was the outgoing German chancellor who initiated the process of Nord Stream 2, which just meant that Europe was in no ways going away from Russia. So, I mean, there are developments all across in the former Soviet states, which were enough evidence to show that the intentionality of Putin was changing, just as the intentionality of Xi Jinping has been pointed out. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize even actors whom are speaking very different languages, right? So, I mean, to say that India bought oil and the Europeans never did, well, the Europeans invested in a second pipeline. There was no talk about getting away. There was no talk about diversifying. It was rather about intensifying, right? And that has come to haunt what has put Europe in terms of its, So I think probably this kind of, putting each other under the microscope maybe happened for the better. I think it's given a huge reality check both in Europe and in India to recognize that you are in a world with tough choices, and a strategic partnership and good friendships should be able to go through moments of tough choices. They cannot wither away just because partners make tough choices, right? I mean, I think the ability of a partnership to wear a storm is the true test. You can't create a better test, than what has been offered at this point, where Delhi has, kind of very politely and firmly said that you cannot just package your interest. And the sanctions, if you saw from the 24th of February, which kind of put oil out of everything, and then even slow and steady with ifs and buts and all of it, really tells you at the end of the day what really counts is interest, right? And I think at the, every government would have to stand up and say that it will have to answer for its own interest, because the people will ask their own government. They're not going to ask any other government. And I think that the impact of this war, the domino impact of this war, has been visible on us. So there's no luxury we have. The luxury of geography does not exist even for India or for any other country in this world. I think what the pandemic has shown and the war has shown is we are living in a very, very interdependent, highly, penetrated economies, which means that the challenge is far more, and the harm can be far more grievous than had been previously thought. So I think I see this as probably, a good wake-up call to recognize how do you prioritize your equations. That's what I think.
That's very well stated, Peter. Yes.
Maybe I can add something, because war from in my generation, so I was born in the late 60s, was something which was far away. And my generation is now in the government and in the important positions in Germany. So war was something happening elsewhere. I've been to Bosnia in the 90s as a journalist and traveled former Yugoslavia, but this was a civil war, of course. This was not a World War I like the war now in Ukraine. This is more World War I sometimes than World War II. What's happening in Ukraine, and so and even in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, it was more like the military operations and the wars of Russia in Abkhazia or South Ossetia or Nagorno-Karabakh. So there was not really a discussion whether there was a common border between the country which this aggression of Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. Discussed the direction of Poland or maybe Slovakia or something. So this is this shows how big the shock was in February, and how many has changed in the German perception ever since. And this is crucial to understand when looking at the Indo-Pacific region, and why they are suddenly this interested in what's happening here.
Okay, I do have a question to ask you, which is to do with the German foreign minister's visit to Delhi, Annalena Baerbock, and you would have tracked it closely. What is your takeaway on this, and how does it tie up with what we're discussing this evening?
Sorry, the last.
How does it relate to what we're discussing this evening?
There was we had a background talk with the foreign minister. Of course, I cannot quote from this talk, but let's put it like this: I have the impression there's a change in the perception of the German government, also in the what concerning the oil imports of India. They seem to more or less accept it as necessary. They don't point it out that much because it's not that popular in the European Union. And also they are quite enthusiastic about changes of the stance of the perspective of the Indian government in the past weeks, namely the G20 declaration and the the quote of Prime Minister Modi. This is not a time of war. This is deemed to be very important by the German government. They are quite very positive about India. And what changes India showed in the past, even in the past weeks. So, and of course, this was an important visit. It was the first visit of her as a foreign minister. Soon there will be a second visit, as far as I know. The chancellor is expected twice next year here in India, and this was totally different before. So this shows how important this region has become in the recent times. So, and this is the first visit, and there are many to come now.
Professor Pant, Peter just brought up G20, of course, and it is India's moment in the global spotlight with the G20 presidency this year. How do you think this is going to change the perception of India in the world, and then also its relations with Europe?
I think there is a lot of expectation from India. If you see the statements coming out from European capitals, even Washington, there is a sense that they expect India's presidency to deliver something substantive. And Indian Prime Minister has stated we want it to be decisive and action oriented, etc., etc. I think from our point of view, it is interesting that in some ways. India's global leadership of G20 is going to impact India's foreign policy over the course of next year. And some of the signs are already visible. I think what Peter was mentioning, this slight posturing, publicly commenting, Mr. Modi sitting beside Mr. Putin saying that, look, this is not the time for war. I mean, he could have easily done this behind closed doors and not just like he was doing before. But I think there is a gradual shifting of that stance. Again, G20 Bali communique, very interesting, where I think India played a very important role in bringing that communique together and bringing all the stakeholders together. And I think just today's news that Mr. Modi is not visiting Moscow for the annual summit also has an underlying message here that, look, this is, he could have easily visited. I think there is clearly the sense, an emerging sense that the next year will be the one where India will be under the spotlight, and India's leadership will be evaluated, analyzed very, very clinically. And I think as partnerships go, India will have to manage multitude of partners in a way that perhaps the West as a bloc is India's most important partner. And the first question that you talk about, what has changed? I think one of the things that has changed is that, and I'm sure Professor Bawa would bear me out, this has seen unabashedly pro-Western. So there is. I mean, there is no hesitation in arguing that, look, we are partners, and I think also very articulating very openly that this partnership is based on a sense of pragmatism, that India's developmental trajectory needs Western support, needs European support, and I think there has been no hesitation in articulating this very vividly and very openly, and that I think that transparency helps, because that allows our interlocutors to also assess our behavior and our interpretation of certain global developments and regional developments in a certain light. So I think there has been this transition, and that transition is now being, from India's perspective, this is now implicated in what India does over the course of the next year. And so the idea that you would play a role at the G20, where a lot of the questions about ostensibly they're about economy, climate change, trade, sustainable development, digital technology, etc. But geopolitics is now, shaping most of these conversations. You really cannot have any conversation today which is devoid of the geopolitical element. This idea that let's trade with friends has become, let's trade and become friends has become almost let's trade among friends. So I think the trade technology cooperation, the relationship about supply chains, all of these questions, as India takes this conversation forward over the course of next year, will have a great bearing on how India converses with its European partners. And without European partner support, I think the journey would be that much difficult. So you do see that pragmatism there. You do see that evaluation that you know some those on both sides. You do see is a greater degree of understanding about where India is coming from, right? If when when the crisis started in February, it was doom and gloom. Oh, India is going to be, face very difficult choices, and Americans, Western countries are going to be disappointed, or America, Moscow, India will have to make. But I think India has made those choices fairly, in a reasonable manner. And I think the best part of this, or perhaps the most optimistic aspect of this, has been conveying to our Western friends our requirements. That look, if you are standing eyeball to eyeball with Chinese soldiers, you really don't have the luxury of publicly condemning a partner country on which you rely 60 to 70% for your defense imports. And I think creditably today, you do see that understanding in European capitals. And I think Peter did exactly right. You've seen an entire arc from February to December. There is a better understanding of where India is coming from, even on oil issue. So I think that tells you that the trajectory is right, because you will have greater spotlight over you over the next year. It would be incumbent upon India to do this balancing even better, or even more consciously perhaps than it has done so far. But I think it would also involve a lot of support from those who believe that we are going to shape the Indo-Pacific together as like-minded partners.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in just one last question before I open it up to all of you, Professor Bawa. Professor Pant had actually said, or I'm definitely sure, but someone said that we have to make the most of this opportunity that we have. I'm going to shift it for a minute from geopolitics, which seems so urgent now, and ask you the question of people to people ties. And I'm not sure if you've given some thought to this, but how do you think India and EU can capitalize on it in the way that I think, let's say, India and America are able to do much more visibly?
So I think the people-to-people ties have always been embedded in the relationship. I mean, whether you look at the bilateral documents or even otherwise, I think what you're looking at is a different kind of a strategic depth to this people-to-people. I think with the German foreign minister's visit, you had the signing of an understanding on migration and mobility, which is a big boost to higher education. Uh, and I think there is a repositioning happening in terms of recognizing that India is not just a cheap supply of labor. I think that's a very important point, which very often was on the table. I think to recognize that it can be a win-win situation of a different kind. That is point number one. Point number two is also Delhi is also, I think, articulating it very differently. It's not just about thinking of your diaspora over there and what they can contribute, but more importantly, thinking about how do we shape the moment going forward from here. And I think one would see a lot more coming, not only in the India-EU migration and mobility, but also in terms of uh, emphasizing that, how would you bring science, technology, human sciences, and more importantly, issues which are related to global governance are ultimately about delivery of global public goods. And one such good was, of course, health, which came out as being the lowest invested in terms of global governance. India has shown also the lead in terms of vaccine development. So I think some of these things are there, at least for science to build up, and for humanities to also look at how do we do problem solving together. So I think we've got an opportune moment. It also requires, easing up of restrictions and to be more pro people than be people suspect. I think that is extremely important, because normally the issue of migration and mobility is people suspect. One is looking at them as a bunch of problems coming in. But if you look at it as something which is a net contribution, not only to the economy, but also to the body of ideas, then I think you imagine the whole way you can look at people in a far more creative sense. And I think, I mean, I can say specifically for Germany, if I think, 15 years back, if I told students, why don't you go to Europe, go to Germany to study, and everybody would think, oh, they would need German language, otherwise they won't be able to do it. I mean, today, Germany is one of the fastest growing. And the biggest challenge, was, of course, because the visa stopped with the COVID, that getting the visa back. And this was an issue which came up. In fact, if anybody ever followed the tweet of the German ambassador for a couple of days, if he posted something, immediately there will be 10 tweets with the application number saying that, can you please get my visa facilitated? I think that's such a phenomenal shift from thinking of Europe in a people-to-people connect. UK was this point. Everything is focused to that, and one can understand. Language provides the base for easy flow, but today Europe per se is emerging as an option, a choice. So I think this is where the conversations need to happen. You need to go beyond stereotypes. You need to, open up the idea where people, and I think the job of everybody in this room, including my job, it's important. How do we become a force multiplier? Because the bad stories carry the day. Good stories that we have one of the world's largest health immunization program. Probably very few people knew about it, right? I mean, a child immunization program. And these are the kind of things we need to talk and build up. There is huge capacities for cooperation. But if you don't go beyond stereotypes, you will then still think of, India's moment in the sun for G20. It's not just about that, but it's also about showcasing. India could not have chosen when it will do it. It is going on, right? Each country is allotted. We did not choose when to have the pandemic and a war in Europe. So the leadership of the G20, for example, of a multilateral group comes at a time when you can really now, walk the talk and show that, okay, we have the capacity, we can deliver of a different kind. And in the next few years, it passes into the entire global South, the leadership. So it's also about reimagining partnership of a different kind. I think that is extremely important. And India is once again, pitching to be the voice of the global South as it was one time earlier. And it's not non-alignment 2.0, but I think it's about what the pandemic and the war has done is pushed SDGs back. It's pushed global development agenda back by more collectively. It's never happened at a human scale as it's happened now. So I think this is where the kind of connections we can establish through these different fora are going to become extremely important.
Absolutely agree. We are here this evening because of people-to-people ties, of course. Please put your hand out.
Here. So I'll pass the mic. If you're representing a media, you can introduce yourself and your media.
Hi, I'm Kundan Pandey from Mongabe, India. And I write on climate change. So whenever the negotiation is happening on climate change, if you see the past, developed world and developing countries have been always opposite. Like they were talking something different, not suiting to each other. But in recent past, what we have seen, in this COP that recently concluded, when India called for the phase down of all fossil fuels, European countries came forward and supported this idea. So my question is, because India has a perspective about the energy requirement, and the majority of the people are still lacking the energy access. So India was raising this issue in the context of the taking action for climate change. Now, European Union is also facing similar kind of problem because of the Ukraine-Russia war. They have an energy crisis. So do you think this crisis will bring these two negotiators or two parties together for the bigger challenge, climate change?
Who's that question for? Who wants to take it on? Peter? We'll
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. That's something I thought as well. This could bring us together because of the necessities of the moment. And this is maybe this is a part of the explanation why the German government now seems to more understand why India needs this energy from Russia. Of course, this is an interesting part of the cooperation. You have the Greens in the German government, and of course they absolutely support all these measures against climate change. And for them, it's important to have partners also in South Asia who support this vision. And the only problem is, where's the money? Where comes the money from? And you know this. They may be okay with the 2070 goal of India, but also 2070 is something which can only be reached if it's financed from elsewhere as well. So I think there will be problems, and also for the German government when they see, we have partners who support this change, but they want our money. So this is a question which hasn't been answered yet. So and this will be a big problem because it's wishful thinking, and you see what the Green foreign minister is telling here, but at the end there has to be money to finance this change, and it cannot only come from Germany. It has to come from the European Union. It has to come from other countries as well.
Can I just add in terms of what Peter mentioned? You know, what is also interesting is that you have to look at the negotiating tactics also have evolved. So, you know, India's position used to be very antagonistic towards the developed world. So, you know, this posturing in favor of the developing country, but very antagonistic towards it. And I think that has changed. Today, the idea is that let's find solutions to these problems. So climate finance is a problem. Green finance is a problem. How do we find solution to that? Not that you raise a banner and say down with the developed world, but try to negotiate in a manner that allows you to resolve some of these fundamental conundrums. And I think that's a change that is paying some dividends in terms of what you mentioned, that there is greater convergence. Of course, you know, there is a climate crisis in Europe. There is a sense that, you know, we are all in the same boat, and there is a sense that India is. But India has also changed. India's position on climate has evolved. India's position on negotiations has evolved. And I think that makes a difference when you go to the nitty-gritty of these negotiations.
Okay.
I just had a small part to add, because what we also seen, like, I mean, it was not only the agreement on mobility and migration. I mean, it was also the talk about, there had been agreement with the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation about the BMZ, which is about how to overcome this energy transition, which is also one of the big points. On the other hand side is also one of the big points Germany want to work on with India's neighbor Pakistan. So I'm also looking forward to how these relations will be balanced out. Of course, it's too difficult to solve this evening, but I mean, this is also something which we have seen during the G20, that of course also Germany is going steps towards India's neighbor because of the necessity given to the climate change.
I would like to add two thoughts I just have. First, you see that there's a lack of experience in the German government concerning India and the whole region. And there was a small point with what the foreign minister said a few weeks ago about Kashmir. Yeah. And if she would have had advisors who know the regions very well, she would never say this. I'm pretty much sure that shows a lack of experience and lack of knowledge about the region and all what's about sensitive matters here. That's the first thought. You mentioned this mobility pact. this is quite interesting. It's the first kind of contract or treaty between Germany and a country of origin, as we call it in Germany. If it would be a contract, a pact with Turkey, for example, or with let's say Algeria or Tunisia, it would have been widely discussed in Germany. But this was only noticed that day, and there was no discussion. We don't even know what is in this mobility pact because it hasn't been published yet. I've been trying for several days to get the text of this pact. It's not possible. You don't get it from the Indian side, and you don't get it from the German side. So you have a press information about it from several ministries, but we really don't know what is in the pact. So this shows where we are in the discussion in Germany and in the perception. Yeah, we don't discuss. I don't know what's the idea behind it, and I don't know what's in this pact. So. Right. So this shows. So sadly, this shows the importance of the region still in Germany.
That's interesting. I wonder why we don't know about the pact. Is it because they've not thought it through? Raghav, you have a question.
Some people in India feel that these sort of things are being made by design. The idea is to somehow get India to, come to a position closer to that of the Ukraine position Ukraine was. Some people are making that connection in India, and so I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't think so. I really don't think so. Our foreign minister studied international law, and so I think that's something which comes from inside her. Yeah, that's her thinking. But as I said, if she would have had advisors who are experienced with the region, they would have told her to not to do such remarks at the moment. But I don't think so. By design. This is not something intentional to push India somewhere.
I think at times we overthink what the Europeans are doing. We just don't know. So I think it's just sheer confusion, and we try to overinterpret and interpret as to what is happening in Europe. The simple answer is that there's no clarity there. That's why
But I think that's also part of how misperceptions and stereotypes sustain, because I can tell you, how limited is the study of South Asia in Germany and in some of the other European countries. There are very few India experts.
And vice versa?
Yeah. I think it's also because of, sometimes it's a bit of politics, but I think this lack of, on the information highway on both sides, there's a perception deficit huge. So which means that, many things are not told, many things would not get picked up. So Europe is fed through London to New Delhi. And, the other way also happens, which means that many things, even in India, are lost and not reaching European shores in that way. And it's easier to then sustain these other kind of stereotyped images, and probably this is an opportunity to ask. So can you connect the dots differently? I think that's a very, very important question that's not being asked. I think the world and Europe got surprised that India would develop a vaccine. I'm telling you, that we were not standing in line to just get something else which would be made somewhere and not indigenously developed, right? And so that also tells you about what is the kind of modern day science stories and miracles are we talking about, right? It's not that everything is to be packaged and sent in a particular way, or how do you look at indigenization of issues which is happening over here? So I think this information deficit is extremely important in the way.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, and since a lot of people here are from the media, if you see the Western media, you do see a persistence of stories about Modi government, how bad it is, how insidious things are happening in India. Maybe yes, maybe there are bad things happening in a country of 1.4 billion, but there are other stories. Please carry them to your audiences. I mean, I don't see them being carried in the Western media, which is a shame, because I think it also is, there is a lot of stereotyping happening. There is a lot of, and I think in a way, we also see that in Indian media, right? We don't have our correspondents that are based in major European capitals. So we are not getting those stories from the West, which are more granular, more down to earth. So I think that is a big problem. And in terms of people-to-people ties, it really hinders, because a lot of us carry these stereotypes. You carry them, I carry them, and then we say, oh, it is Kashmir, and we are saying Ukraine, and we are talking at cross purposes. So I think academia, media, I think will have to play a larger role here in terms of just shaping that consciousness that things may not be as bad as they seem on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, like one example was the platform for accessing the vaccination. It was a rapid response once the vaccine was ready to be brought into the public domain. And I'm telling you from a user end perspective, I mean, when you first looked at the website, it was really poor. I mean, when you think that the amount of brain power which is available in India to design it. But I would not look at it that way. I would look at it more in the sense there was obviously a brief to design and launch a public portal, ASAP. But once that happened, and I did this more than out of curiosity rather than anything else, I would periodically go and check every 2 weeks what happened. I did that. It was amazing. I mean, that feedback was going. It was only first accessible in English, which meant that only a limited group of people. So I think these are the kind of issues that also one can bring out to say that, okay, what happened, right? Today it's available in multiple language. You can do all kind of fancy things on it and still see. And if you ask the younger lot, they will even tell you how you can hack it. So interesting stories come out of it. But it's also a way of tracking. Can you track a different story and ask 1.3 billion? Yes, it's not perfect solution in terms of delivery of a vaccine, but did India make a step forward in trying to put it together and trying to go forward? So you can talk of a story like that, the downside of some of these things which didn't manage or go down too well, but also look at how subsequently some of things moved. So I think the story is always somewhere in between. It's not these two extremes which we often look at, and I think that's an important point to be told.
Okay, I'm going to bring in one last question, Sukudha. We can see if we have, okay, so we can get two questions. Let's get both the questions together. Sukudha first and then that, and then we out of time.
So speaking of perception and moving beyond stereotypes.
Sorry, maybe you should introduce yourself.
I'm Sukada and I'm an independent journalist. So moving beyond stereotypes and perception, I think this question is for Peter, because you said you see some changes at the policy level at how South Asia and specifically India is being perceived. But in terms of stories in Western media, in European media, what are the kind of stories that are coming there? Like people, for example, Natalie, who works here, she's often spoken about how difficult it is to place certain kinds of stories in German publications. So is that landscape changing, and what needs to be done for Europe to be accepting of some different kinds of stories coming from the region?
Sorry, can we just get the last question? And then no.
Hi, this is Sridhar from the Asian Age. I was just wondering, I wanted to ask a question about what the perception of the acquisition of Russian oil by India is in Europe, actually, because you have a certain, it's sort of back and forth between the Indian government and the bad European media. So what exactly, where does the truth lie? Are people really sort of skeptical of the Indian position?
I think that's answer for you. You have the last.
Yeah, about the landscape changing in journalism and media. I think the politicians are faster than the journalists at the moment. It's a story we all can tell about German media, that you what you sell is stories about stereotypes. They sell best to German media, also to Western media. I don't have to sell, by the way. I'm as a correspondent, I do reports, and some of the programs do use them, others don't. But from the whole region, this is a problem. It's about stereotypes. It's about catastrophes. The bridge in Gujarat is more interesting than an interesting project elsewhere in UP or so. So how to change it? Yeah, you have to offer stories about you have to offer different stories about a better India, about an innovative India, about IT stories, whatever. It's constructive. There's a huge necessity for constructive journalism from India for Western Europe, for example. So, but this is a task for the journalists here, and we are the ones to convince the editors back in Europe, for example. But maybe there is a shift in perception when after the Ukraine war and after the whole thing goes on. But this will take a time. So in this aspect, the government is faster than the media. And second, people in Germany are very skeptical about the Russian oil, the cheap Russian oil for India. And this is what I keep on explaining the past weeks and months, that India needs this energy, that India doesn't have the choice. And also there's energy from the Gulf states, from the Middle East, which is more expensive now because the Europeans are buying their gas and oil there. And so you have to tell the stories, but at first sight, the people are very skeptical, and this is the narrative you hear in Germany. Oh, how about the Indians? They support the Russians because they are buying the oil. And then you say, as your foreign minister says, the European Union is buying more oil in an afternoon than India in a whole month. So yeah, but this also is something you have to tell again and again.
Hey, thank you.
Can I just add on the last point? I think it's extremely interesting how stories are put together and they're narrated till you start believing in them. And the European story after 24th of February was the oil bought, and the energy dependence of Europe is far more, important than the dependence of others. And I think it's time to kind of really put it out in the open and put out because if Europe was so concerned about rights violation, if Europe was so concerned about doing business with Russia, it would have stopped doing business with Russia long back and business with China. So I think these kind of stories, which talk only about the human rights of one part of the world and ignores the human rights of other parts of the world, are only part self-fulfilling stories told to placate your own public and your own shareholders, and the fact that Russia chose a very inopportune time to declare war. I mean, if Putin had some kind of a personal astrologer, would have told him at least have the Nord Stream 2 commissioned. The certification was pending when he did that. And of course, poor strategy. So I think India at that point in time, many people were not aware, was buying less than 1% of Russian oil. Our energy basket is extremely diversified. So this whole attention was because Russia, with whom India has a very multi-variable relationship and partnership going back to a long point in time, decided in a very pragmatic sense from national interest, because when inflation hits you, it hits everybody at home in Indian household, and the government would have to respond to it, right? We saw cooking oil prices go up in the month of February from 125 to 300 rupees a liter in just about 2 weeks. And probably first time Indians got to know that 75% of India's sunflower imports are coming from Ukraine. We were not aware of it, right? So it's not just that the war is hitting Europe and they are making the right choices. The point is who's making the different kind of noises, right? So just because a choice is applicable to one country, it does not mean a choice is not available to another country. Point number two, being strategic partners doesn't mean that you don't, discuss what are the concerns of, your partner, right? And I think this is where you've seen the conversation move in Europe as well to recognize that India was also making use of an opportunity which has presented itself to it from purely a financial point of view. Our largest part of our import bill is on on getting oil and gas. So why wouldn't you capitalize on that, just as Germany capitalized for so many years on getting cheap gas? Right. So I think the point is about how do you bring a question onto the table and be able to face the truth squarely. It doesn't make it better for one country because their need is more important, and you can just kind of downgrade the interest of another country. And I think that is what probably the world has taken up, that India is speaking the language of putting its interest first. And I think that's something which every country does. The only difference is we're doing it far more forcefully because the spotlight has been turned on. I think if the spotlight has been turned on to Europe as well, and say that how come you justify purchasing it for so many years? There is no answer to that. So I think rather than calling out names, the important question, and this is to that COP issue and climate change, the only way to get out of this is to really support each other. Only then will it happen. You have to do a just transition, a green transition, a carbon-free transition. It can only happen when there is a genuine partnership. Right? It cannot be that there is cheap oil and gas for one, but it cannot be for the other. I don't think that kind of an argument is going to sell any longer. And I don't think New Delhi is going to take kindly to any of these kind of arguments, which try to paint a moralistic, a human rights-based argument. I don't think it sells. And the reality is far more evident now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stretch it by just a couple of minutes. Any last words, Professor Pant, before we wrap up?
No, nothing really. I think just that it's a partnership which has begun to take shape and which is quite substantive in more ways than one, because I think both in Europe and in India, there is a need, there is a desire for greater strategic autonomy. The sense of bipolarity that we are witnessing today, both between China and America. I think the European Union and India both value that. So that I think brings the two in a very similar situation structurally, and perhaps that's going forward. That's going to be the big change or big driver of the relationship, and also the fact that multilateral order is just collapsing. So both India and Europe believe that a strong multilateral order helps middle powers like European countries and India, and therefore again it is important that some kind of architecture is created, and I think those discussions have begun. And they seem to be, in a much more positive direction than any that we have seen over the last 2 decades. So I think it's a really positive story.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting discussion, and of course, it has underlined the urgency of the Europe-India relationship. And I want to thank each of our panelists for taking out time for this discussion and for supporting the Indo-German Media Network. Thank you, Professor Pant. Thank you, Professor Pahwa, and thank you, Peter. And thank you to the audience for being here. We have drinks outside, and I'm just going to do one last shout out for the network and say that we have forms in case you want to join. Then we will just have those ready. But thank you for being here with us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.